In today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on mountains as a subject, how to handle them. And of course, it depends on whether the mountains are a focal point in the painting or whether they're just something in the background to create more interest in the background and to show more depth, which they certainly do. So if we look at it in terms of a focal point, and of course it has to be interesting. I can't just decide in a poor photograph where the mountains really aren't that interesting that they're going to be the focal point. It has to be something like this where they really stand out and they become more of the focal point. And I got several images here. And in all of these, I think the mountains are more the focal point. Now, I can do more down in here with the trees, the color, the contrast, the water, and make that the focal point where the eye goes right there first, then maybe to the mountains. But, that's a decision you make, and you paint everything accordingly. So it helps to really decide if it's the focal point or not. And of course, that's true with whatever you're painting. Find a focal point or make whatever subject in the photograph really drew your eye, make that the focal point. Painting is going to be a lot better. Same thing here. Here the sunlit orange mountains are just about the warmest color. Probably the orange, orange-green trees here might be a bit more intense, more chroma. But these really stand out. You don't need to do much to these and make them more the focal point. They just are, mainly because the foreground's in shadow. It's cooler, not much color, so the color in the mountains really stands out. Same thing here. You could create your focal point right in this area, somewhere in there. But the contrast of the values of the trees and the strong chroma of the yellow and the yellow-orange and the dark and light. But this is very strong, especially with the darker sky. It really pops out without a doubt. And the sky can be that dark, especially in the west, with the sun kind of behind the viewer, which it is here. It's kind of behind over to the left a little bit, but it's still behind. It's not in front of the viewer. Then the sky would get real light, and you would have more subtle color and value changes within the mountains. This one, I think if I pull together the strong lights of the snow here. In other words, not too many of the darks showing through. Maybe give a little more color in the shadow of the rocks and the shadow on the trees to make that stand out. Now, if I want these mountains to be the focal point, I can't put the darkest dark. Your center of interest is where your darkest dark is and lightest light. Well, that can't happen here because the focal point's way in the background. So the darkest dark will be here and maybe right in here. But I can put some stronger color in there. As long as I keep it cooler. Obviously it can't jump out of the picture plane, be so strong that it comes forward, but I can make it a bit stronger than just gray. These would still be the strongest colors, but there's not much contrast in the foreground with the exception of right here, and I might knock that down. I don't want a lot of contrast in the foreground when my center of interest is going to be like right in here. So I can create the most contrast back here and knock down the contrast in the foreground. Because the trees here, the evergreen trees, which are pretty strong, they don't have a lot of strong contrast because the lights are fairly dark. Now the chroma of the color is pretty strong, but the value is dark, so there's not much contrast there. Not much contrast in the grass. There's more contrast in the mountains, and if I push that a bit more, maybe fill in the snow a bit more solid, more of a solid shape, so they stick out more. A little bit more color, and it get much colorful in the rocks, but a little bit more. It draws your attention up here because this is the most contrast. So that's going to draw my attention. Also, cropping it in such a way that I get rid of the stuff that just creates too much busyness in the composition. And I want to crop it so that, one peak isn't dead center or one tree isn't dead center. But now there's less to compete with the cliffs back in here, these three cliffs. And I can have that strong contrast there and play up the color a little bit in the background. Same thing with this. I could always knock down the yellows slightly with intensity. I could, if I move this large tree here, like move it just off center here, create more of this dark, get more dark in there, more contrast. Maybe the most yellow aspens around this area. Then that could be the focal point along with some of the water. Or, again, I could make the mountain the focal point and play up the shadows here. It has a good contrast already between the trees on the mountains and the rocks, the shadows and the sunlit rocks. So there's a lot going on there that makes that the focal point, especially the strong sky. Also, if I take some of these lines of rock in the trees and move them around so that these lines of rocks will kind of, your eye really follows this form here, and then it could pick up some of those lines of rocks and move right up that way. So if I get these trees lighter here and play around with the shape of these rocks that create kind of lines in the composition, so the viewer's eye can kind of follow this way, and then it can pick up these lines of the rocks, and it leads it each time to more of the peak. Plus I'm getting the trees back in here, these trees lighter. So there's more contrast in value and temperature, lighter and cooler, and these are a little darker and more yellow green, and that creates more contrast. And this one too, I can, again, that's about my strongest color, the mountain. So it's already the focal point. I could probably increase the value lighter on these trees to suggest that drama of that strong evening light, and maybe make these shadows a bit bluer, a little bit stronger color to give more of that warm, cool contrast back there in the mountains. But because of the darker shadow in front and not much color in front, this becomes about the strongest color in there. And you can always do a couple of things like reduce the size of this tree and increase the size of the mountains to make them more important. I'm not making up anything, I'm just increasing the size to change the importance of the different shapes in the canvas. This one too, the snow is obviously the lightest. A lot of contrast up in here. So here the mountains are definitely the focal point. Lightest light, darkest dark would still be, small darks would be in here. But probably the darkest big dark would be this in here. And I could always make it a bit bigger. You could always change things to increase contrast and focal point. Again, they can't be this big shape cannot be as dark as these little accents, but it's still the darkest big shape in the photograph, or would be in the painting. So a lot of things to do to make the mountains more interesting, bigger, focal point. One thing too, I want to use value to really emphasize the shape of these, really be aware of the value changes that make the mountains go back, catch sunlight and shadow. In other words, these value changes really show form. The form changes every time the value changes. So the only way to show any shape on these mountains is the shadows go a direction. It's just the fact that the dark values go in one direction here, then it changes value and goes this direction. And it is another value there, another one here, and or every time it changes value, it's got to change the shape. So I want it to look like that, like the mountains are gradually receding. And if we don't pay close attention to those value changes, it really flattens out the mountains. Of course, these should be a little lighter than these shadows, just because there's quite a bit of depth between them. But you want that feel of things changing as the value changes. This type of thing. So, in other words, if you were to lay down a ribbon across the mountains, it would go like that. It wouldn't be a straight ribbon. And sometimes we paint mountains and we don't have enough value change, and it looks like that. It looks flat. So really look at and focus on those value changes with the idea that we want to simplify as well. We don't have to paint every little tiny dark and light, but as far as the big shapes, it's real important to focus on those. I've got a few paintings here. This is by Edward Compton. He's an American painter, late 19th century, I think. And what I like about his most of the time his mountains are the focal points. Of course, he's got the strong shadow pattern in here, dark and light. But if we look at his color, his mountains here are a grayish color, and most mountains there's some kind of gray color, kind of like tree trunks. And there's a lot of colors in them. You can see a lot of variation here. But the key is he starts with maybe one color in value, maybe that gray, which would be ultramarine blue and orange. Enough orange to make it look warm. And here's ultramarine blue with a lot less orange. And of course, no white, maybe to speak of. So you get that contrast, but you get one overall color. Maybe here, let's just pick one value that's in there, because it does have about 3 different values in the shadow, 3 or 4 different values in the light. But he starts with one value in each, one dark, one light. Then as he lays these lighter values in there, and maybe some slightly darker in the light area, they sink into that initial color you start with, and it holds it together. Same thing in the shadow, starts with one overall dark value, then kind of scrubs in some of these other colors and values, and that holds it together. It keeps it from just falling apart into a bunch of little separate shapes. While there is separate shapes in there, they still hold together a little bit better. This area up here where maybe started with this color, but then added the blues. It still looks warm. It just looks like a different color change in there. Still looks sunlit anyway. It is a little cooler, but looks sunlit because it's held together by that initial kind of muted red-orange. Here's another one of his, really showing that contrast. The dark here, little lighter yet, lighter, and then lightest as it goes back. So really pay attention to that. A lot of photographs don't show that. That's one of the reasons this doesn't look like a photograph, because photographs don't get that value change that we see in there. Really nice value change in there. And yet there's probably more contrast back here because the snow is just so light. Get a pretty strong focal point in the background, or probably the trees are the focal point, but mountains draw a lot of attention. This is another one of his. I believe it's a watercolor, maybe a little bit of gouache because it's opaque in the snow. But again, strongest contrast is back in here. Those mountains really stand out. Darkest darks are in front, but there's not that much contrast because even the lights are darker compared to the background. So here, this is more of your focal area in there. Not so much down here. I mean, it's interesting, but your eye wants to go to this background area back in there. And notice the simplicity too. Probably a quicker sketch, but the detail is all focused in 1 or 2 areas and not so much in the foreground. I have a couple here from Edgar Payne. And again, you can see color-wise, when we're speaking of color, picks one color, maybe this color. I don't know which one he picked. It might have been the grayer one. Filled in all the lights. Same thing with the darks, probably used more of the darker blue, filled in all the shadows, then came back into the lights, and you see about 3 or 4 different colors that he scrubs in there. Maybe some of them are a little bit of a value change too, but more of just a color change. Then the same thing in the shadow. You've got 2 or 3 different colors, maybe a couple of value changes, 2 or 3 value changes. But start with that one overall color that best suggests the overall value and color of the mountains in the light and the shadow. So another one here, not quite as dramatic. These hills are a bit more subtle with the changes in value. And with this, same way, this is 90% light. So starting with a color like that, then adding the shadow pattern, nice simple shadow pattern. And I always add maybe a bit more than what's there, or place them in an area that just show the form, shape of the mountain a bit better. But he does have a good strong light and halftone. Then he goes to the shadow. So it probably starts with the halftone, which is light, blocks in the whole mountain range, then comes back and hits these dark shapes in here. And then after that hits the lightest light. So there's 3 distinct values here, the light, halftone, and shadow. And those 3 values really give that mountain depth.